My mom called me a leech in front of everyone, so I packed my bags and left. But the truth is, that word didn't start that night. It had been brewing in her mouth for years, sharpening itself every time she needed someone to blame. My name is Rachel Moore. I'm 31 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, worked hard enough, and loved deeply enough, my family would eventually see me. I was wrong. That night was my uncle's birthday dinner, a loud one. Too many people crammed into my parents' dining room, cheap wine in plastic cups, laughter that always felt slightly forced. I almost didn't go. Something in my chest had felt heavy all day, like a warning, but my mom insisted. "You never show up anymore," she'd said on the phone. "People are starting to ask questions." Questions? As if my absence embarrassed her more than my presence ever could. So I went. I arrived early, like I always did, helped set the table, refilled ice trays, wiped counters already clean. I had learned long ago that being useful was the only way to justify my existence in that house. My younger brother, Evan, arrived an hour later, empty-handed, loud, and smiling. Mom lit up the moment she saw him. "There's my boy," she said, pulling him into a hug. I stood a few feet away, invisible. Dinner started fine. Stories, jokes, everyone talking over each other. I barely spoke. I never did. When I did, no one listened anyway. Then someone, my aunt I think, asked a simple question. "So Rachel," she said casually, "are you still working at that nonprofit?" I nodded. "Yes, same place." Mom scoffed before I could say anything else. "Working," she said, waving her hand dismissively, "if you can call it that." The table went quiet. I felt my throat tighten. "I work full-time," I said softly. "You know that." "Oh, please," Mom laughed. "You make what, pennies? And still live at home? Let's be honest." She turned to the table, glass raised slightly, smiling like she was about to tell a joke. "Rachel's basically a leech." The word hit the room like glass shattering. Some people laughed awkwardly, others stared at their plates. No one defended me. Not my father, not my brother, not a single person. I felt my face burn, but my body went strangely calm. A leech. Because I lived in the small guest room I'd moved back into after my divorce. Because I paid my own bills, but not rent because my mom had insisted I move back temporarily. Because I helped around the house, cooked, cleaned, drove my dad to appointments, handled paperwork my mom didn't want to deal with. A leech. I stood up slowly. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Mom rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be dramatic. You know I'm joking." But her lips were tight, her eyes sharp. That was the moment something inside me snapped, not loudly, not violently, but completely. I picked up my purse. "I think I'm going to head out." My dad frowned. "Rachel, sit down." "I'm fine. Enjoy the cake." No one stopped me. Not when I walked out the door, not when I drove away with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, not when I pulled over a mile down the road and cried so hard I thought I might throw up. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind with thin walls and flickering lights. I sat on the bed, staring at my phone, waiting for a message. Nothing. Not from Mom, not from Dad, not from Evan. That silence hurt more than the word ever could. The next morning, I went back to the house while everyone was at work. I packed a suitcase, then another. Clothes, documents, my laptop, the few personal things I'd never unpacked fully because, deep down, I think I always knew. I left my key on the kitchen counter. No note. I moved into a tiny studio apartment the following week. It wasn't much, one window, old carpet, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, no one could call me a burden in my own space. The messages started a few days later. "Mom, where are you? This is ridiculous." "Dad, your mom didn't mean it that way." "Evan, "You're being sensitive. Just apologize and come back." Apologize? For being called a leech? I didn't respond. That's when things changed. Because when I stopped being available, emotionally, physically, and financially, my family started to panic. My mom called my aunt crying about how ungrateful I was. My dad complained about how hard things were without my help. Evan showed up at my apartment one evening unannounced. He leaned against my doorframe like he owned the place. "So," he said, smirking, "you're really going to throw a tantrum over a joke?" I crossed my arms. "You didn't say anything." He shrugged. "It wasn't my fight." That told me everything. "You should apologize," he added. "Mom's been stressed." I laughed, a short, humorless sound. "So was I, for years." He scoffed. "You always do this, play the victim." "No," I said quietly. I finally stopped playing anything. His expression shifted. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." "No," I repeated. "I'm just not being small anymore." He left angry. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things, strange things. My parents' finances were a mess. Late notices started coming to my old email address. Bills I used to manage, appointments I used to schedule were missed. My dad forgot paperwork for his insurance renewal. They needed me. And that's when my mom showed up at my apartment. She stood there with forced tears and a brittle smile. "Can we talk?" she asked. I let her in. She looked around the apartment, nose wrinkling slightly. "This is cozy." I waited. "I may have said something I shouldn't have," she began, "but you embarrassed me by leaving like that." I stared at her. "You embarrassed yourself." She bristled. "I raised you." "You controlled me," I said. "There's a difference." Her face hardened. "You wouldn't survive without this family." I smiled then, slowly. "You're about to find out how wrong you are." She left furious. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last year quietly building something of my own, connections, stability, a future that didn't include being anyone's emotional punching bag. And when my family finally realized what they had lost, it was already too late. I didn't tell anyone where I was going when I packed my bags. Not my mother, not my brother, not even my aunt who lived 3 streets away and always pretended to be neutral. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Short, calm, and deliberate. "I'm leaving. Don't look for me. I need space." No accusations, no drama. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a messy exit. As I closed the door behind me, the house felt strangely hollow, like it had already forgotten me. But for the first time in years, my chest felt lighter. I drove for hours, ending up in a small coastal town where no one knew my last name or my family history. I rented a modest room above a bookstore run by an elderly woman named June, who didn't ask questions, just handed me a key and said, "People come here when they're ready to start again." That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. No guilt dreams, no rehearsed arguments in my head, just silence. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls. My phone buzzed again, as if on cue. My mother's name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. Then my brother. Then a message from my cousin. "Mom's saying you embarrassed her by leaving like that." I almost laughed. Embarrassed her. Even now, the story centered on her feelings, her image, her discomfort. I turned the phone off and went downstairs to the bookstore. June needed help sorting boxes. I offered without thinking. My hands stayed busy. My mind slowly followed. Days passed. I found temporary work at a cafe near the pier. The owner paid cash and didn't pry. I learned the rhythm of the town, the foggy mornings, the slow afternoons, the evenings when locals gathered to watch the tide. I felt anonymous in the best way. No one expected me to fix their problems or fund their choices. No one called me a leech. A week later, an email arrived from my mother. The subject line read, "You've gone too far." She wrote about how hurt she was, how neighbors were asking questions, how my leaving made her look like a bad parent. There it was again, the image. Not once did she mention what she'd said in front of everyone, the words she'd used like a stamp across my forehead. She ended with, "Families don't walk away from each other." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a single sentence. Families also don't humiliate each other for applause. Then I archived the email. What my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't just packed bags, I had also packed evidence. Over the years, I'd kept records out of habit: bank transfers, messages asking for temporary help, emails promising repayment that never came. Not because I planned revenge, but because I was tired of being gaslit, tired of being told I contributed nothing when I'd quietly carried more than my share. 2 weeks after I left, my brother showed up at the cafe. I recognized his car before I saw his face. He looked tired, angry, and unsure, like someone who had practiced a speech and forgotten the words. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee like we were strangers. "Mom's not doing well," he said finally. I wiped the counter. "Is this where I apologize?" He frowned. "She didn't mean it the way it sounded." "That's funny, because it sounded exactly the way she's always treated me." He leaned forward. "You left her scrambling. Bills, repairs, she depended on you." There it was. The truth slipped out by accident. Not love, not concern, dependency. I met his eyes. So I wasn't a leech, I was a lifeline. He didn't answer. "I'm not coming back, but if she wants to talk, really talk, without an audience, without insults, I'll listen. Once." He left without finishing his coffee. A month later, I received a letter from a lawyer. My mother had filed a claim stating I owed her money for living expenses over the past 5 years. I read it twice, then laughed until my sides hurt. It was desperate and reckless, because in trying to punish me, she had opened a door she couldn't close. I hired my own attorney, calm, thorough, unimpressed by theatrics. We laid everything out: the transfers I'd made, the bills I'd paid, the repairs I'd covered, the messages asking for help that framed my contributions as temporary loans. The narrative flipped instantly. What my mother called support was documented as reliance. What she labeled me, a leech, collapsed under receipts and timestamps. Mediation was scheduled. Neutral office, long table. My mother arrived first, dressed for sympathy. When she saw me, her expression hardened. Not relief, not remorse, calculation. She spoke about sacrifice, about motherhood, about how I'd always been sensitive. My attorney let her talk, then slid the folder across the table. Silence followed. For the first time, my mother looked unsure. The mediator cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harris," he said, "the documentation suggests your daughter contributed significantly, financially and otherwise. This claim may not stand." My mother's voice sharpened. "She owes me respect." I spoke then, quiet, steady. Respect isn't something you demand after humiliation. It's something you protect. The claim was withdrawn within the hour. Word spread quickly through the family. The story shifted, again. Now it was about misunderstandings, about stress, about how things were said in the heat of the moment. Invitations followed. Holidays, dinners, olive branches wrapped in guilt. I declined them all, not angrily, politely, consistently. Back in the coastal town, life kept expanding. June offered me the room permanently. The cafe owner promoted me to manager. I started saving, not for emergencies caused by others, but for myself. I learned who I was when no one needed anything from me. Months later, my mother called. No audience, no performance, just her voice, quieter than I remembered. She apologized, not well, not fully, but enough to acknowledge harm. I thanked her for saying it and told her I wasn't ready for more. She accepted it, reluctantly. I didn't pack bags to punish anyone. I packed them to survive. And in doing so, I learned something powerful. When you stop accepting a role that diminishes you, the entire story has to change. I wasn't a leech. I was the one holding the house up. And when I walked away, everyone finally felt the weight.